и в странах, которые находятся за тысячи километров от Беларуси. Объявленные санкции уже не являются точечными. Они направлены на удушение экономики и ухудшение уровня жизни людей. Применяемые сегодня санкции, некоторые договорились до того, что объявляется экономическая война. Это худшее проявление экономического и финансового терроризма. Представители некоторых государств рапортуют о полной открытости их границ для выезда из Украины украинцев и иностранцев, граждан третьих стран. На этой якобы открытой границе, сообщаю вам, граждане Беларуси и России, в частности, все мужчины старше 18 лет, сталкиваются с огромными проблемами при попытках выезда из Украины. Украинские власти не выпускают их из страны, и россияне и белорусы фактически удерживаются в качестве заложников. Известны также случаи проявления расизма и дискриминации, избиения и выкидывания через границу иностранных граждан польскими пограничниками. 26 февраля польские пограничники избили и выдворили обратно на Украину группу из примерно 100 индийских студентов, которые в последующем были благополучно размещены в лагере для беженцев в Румынии. К нам в Минске, в Беларуси, поступают многочисленные обращения как от граждан Беларуси, так и от посольств тех стран, ваших стран, граждане которых хотели бы выехать в Беларусь для возвращения домой. С нашей стороны граница открыта. Мы готовы принимать как белорусов, так и рассматривать обращения о въезде граждан третьих стран. Мы призываем украинскую сторону отозваться на наши призывы и открыть гуманитарные коридоры или хотя бы один гуманитарный коридор для выезда в Беларусь через белорусско-украинскую границу. Мы уже официально обратились с этой просьбой, настоятельной просьбой, в представительство ООН и Международного комитета Красного Креста в Минске. Вызывает серьезное беспокойство разгул издевательств и мародерства, в том числе в отношении иностранцев на Украине. Бесконтрольная раздача оружия уже привела к резкому всплеску насилия и грабежей. Жертвами становятся обычные люди. Например, водители-дальнобойщики, которые осуществляют международные перевозки грузов. Среди них уже есть погибшие. Почему вы все замалчиваете эти факты? Кстати, насколько нам известно, на уровне руководства Африканского союза были уже сделаны соответствующие заявления. Беларусь потеряла треть населения во Второй мировой войне. Мы хорошо знаем цену человеческой жизни. Мы скорбим по всем погибшим за последние 8 лет в Донецкой и Луганской народных республиках, в Киеве. Мы скорбим по людям, которые были заживо сожжены в Одессе. Мы скорбим по всем, кто погибает сегодня. Только переговоры могут остановить кровопролитие. Беларусь уже сделала многое и продолжает делать все возможное для урегулирования конфликта. В любой войне у каждой стороны есть своя правда. Любая война имеет собственную динамику, и по мере ее продолжения становится все более ожесточенной, что мы сегодня и наблюдаем. Мы все буквально тонем в море, в потоке лжи и дезинформации, которые распространяются информационными террористами. По-другому я этих людей назвать не могу. Абсолютное большинство из которых при этом сидит в удобных креслах, в теплых кабинетах за тысячи километров от зоны боевых действий. Через несколько минут мы все приступим к голосованию по внесенному проекту. резолюции. Этот проект на самом деле должен состоять из одного параграфа, написанного не на ООНовском языке, а на нормальном человеческом языке. Он должен содержать призыв к немедленному прекращению военных действий и проведению переговоров. Я понимаю, что у каждого из вас есть инструкции из столицы. Я также знаю, что некоторых из вас очень настойчиво просили проголосовать за этот проект. И я не имею никаких иллюзий по поводу того, какими будут результаты нашего голосования. И все-таки я прошу вас еще раз подумать и проголосовать по совести, хотя я понимаю, что за голосование по совести в ООН можно потерять работу. Благодарю вас за внимание.
I thank the distinguished representative of Belarus. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, my fellow delegates, to all those who dedicate themselves to the noble mission of this institution. Today we call on Russia to stop its unprovoked, unjustified, unconscionable war. We call on Russia to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We call on another neighbor of Ukraine, Belarus, who you've just heard from, to stop supporting the war and stop allowing its territory to be used to facilitate this aggression. And today, we stand together in holding Russia accountable for its violations of international law and to address the horrific human rights and humanitarian crisis unfolding before our eyes. This is an extraordinary moment. For the first time in 40 years, the Security Council has convened an emergency special session of the General Assembly. 40 years. Most of the men and women fighting in Ukraine were not even born the last time the United Nations came together in this way to unite for peace. And I would venture that many of the people in this room were not born when that happened. But a few of the eldest Ukrainians and Russians might recall a moment like this, a moment when one aggressive European nation invaded another without provocation to claim the territory of its neighbor. A moment when a European dictator declared he would return his empire to its former glory. An invasion that caused a war so horrific that it spurred this organization into existence. Now, at more than any other point in recent history, the United Nations is being challenged. If the United Nations has any purpose, it is to prevent war. It is to condemn war, to stop war. That is our job here today. It is the job you were sent here to do, not just by your capitals, but by all of humanity. A lot has happened very quickly to bring us to this unique moment. It was barely a week ago when, in the dead of night, President Putin launched a full-scale invasion of our fellow UN member state. At the very moment the Security Council was holding an urgent meeting attempting to foster diplomacy and de-escalation. As the Security Council discussed peace, Putin declared war. Ukraine has defended itself with great courage and vigor. As President Biden said in his State of the Union address last night, President Putin, and I quote, met a wall of strength he never imagined. He met the Ukrainian people. But the brazen and indiscriminate nature of Russia's attack has had devastating, horrific consequences for the entire country. Russia has bombed residential apartment buildings. It has bombed sacred burial grounds. It has shelled kindergartens and orphanages and hospitals. Russia has spurred mass hunger and caused so many to flee their homes. The latest UN estimate are marching toward 1 million people. We thank the countries who have opened their borders, who have opened their hearts, opened their homes to those fleeing Ukraine. And I want to echo the UN Refugee Agency's call to help and welcome all those fleeing conflict without regard to race or nationality. Refugees are refugees. For those who remain, Russia is destroying critical infrastructure, vital services which provide millions of people across Ukraine with drinking water to stay alive, gas to keep people from freezing to death. And now it appears Russia is preparing to increase the brutality of its campaign against Ukraine. We've seen videos of Russian forces moving exceptionally lethal weaponry into Ukraine, which has no place on the battlefield. That includes cluster munitions and vacuum bombs, which are banned under the Geneva Convention. We all have seen the 40-mile-long lethal convoy charging toward Kyiv. President Putin continues to escalate, putting Russia's nuclear forces on high alert, threatening to invade Finland and Sweden. At every step of the war, Russia has betrayed the United Nations. Russia's actions go against everything this body stands for. People across the world have already united together in exactly the way this General Assembly must do today. Protests and vigils against Russia's war and in solidarity with Ukraine, marked with blue and yellow, have sprung up across the globe. These are protests for peace. From Bangkok to Budapest, from Berlin to Buenos Aires, from Sydney to Seoul, from Calgary to Cape Town, and even in Moscow and Minsk. People everywhere are standing up to call for President Putin to stop this attack. The Russian people are themselves asking how many lives Putin will sacrifice for his cynical ambitions. And they are appalled at the answer. To the Russian protesters, I say thank you. Thank you for your bravery. To the Russian soldiers sent to the front lines of an unjust, unnecessary war, I say your leaders are lying to you. Do not commit war crimes. Do everything you can to put down your weapons and leave Ukraine. The truth is that this war was one man's choice and one man alone, President Putin. It was his choice to force hundreds of thousands of people to stuff their lives into backpacks and flee the country, to send newborn babies into makeshift bomb shelters, to make children with cancer huddle in hospital basements, interrupting their treatment, essentially sentencing them to death. Those were President Putin's choices. Now it's time for us to make ours. The United States is choosing to stand with the Ukrainian people. We are choosing, in coordination with our allies and partners, to impose severe consequences on Russia. We are choosing to hold Russia accountable for its actions, and we will soon turn to vote on a resolution that does just that. We believe this is a simple vote. Vote yes if you believe UN member states, including your own, have a right to sovereignty and territorial integrity. Vote yes if you believe Russia should be held to account for its actions. Vote yes if you believe in upholding the UN Charter and everything this institution stands for. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the United States. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Observer State of the Holy See.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, thank you for calling this emergency special session, as in recent days we have been shaken by something tragic, war. The Holy See joins the many member states and millions across the globe who call for the immediate cessation of hostilities in Ukraine and the return to diplomacy and dialogue. Mr. President, the organization is founded to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. It is the duty of all states to seek to resolve disputes through negotiation, mediation, or by other peaceful means, even when war has commenced. Mr. President, last Sunday, Pope Francis expressed his closeness with all who now suffer as a result of the conflict, stressing that, and I quote, "It is urgent to open humanitarian corridors, and those fleeing must be welcomed." With heart broken by what is happening in Ukraine, and let us not forget the wars in other parts of the world, I repeat, put down your weapons. Those who love peace reject war as an instrument of aggression against the freedom of other peoples and as a means for the settlement of international disputes. End of quote. The Holy See wishes to express, also in this forum, its appreciation to those states which are offering humanitarian assistance to those in need, both in Ukraine and in neighboring countries, in which many Ukrainians have sought safety. Mr. President, Pope Francis has called on believers and non-believers alike to observe this Wednesday, 2nd of March, as a day to be close to the suffering of the Ukrainian people, to feel that we are all brothers and sisters, and to implore of God the end of this war. The Holy See is convinced that there is always time for goodwill. There is still room for negotiations. There is still a place for the exercise of a wisdom that can prevent the predominance of partisan interest, safeguard the legitimate aspiration of everyone, and spare the world from the folly and horrors of war. May this emergency special session advance efforts that help attain this end. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Holy See. I now give the floor to the observer of the Sovereign Order of Malta.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished representatives, the Sovereign Order of Malta, a sovereign entity which provides global humanitarian aid with a special mission to serving the sick and the poor, has observed with great sadness and regret the ongoing conflict which has impacted the lives of so many citizens of Ukraine, and which is currently created an unprecedented flow of refugees seeking peace and security across their nation's borders. In 8 years of conflict, the Order's embassy to Ukraine has provided considerable support, advice, and material help to Ukrainian citizens and to non-Ukrainian residents of the country who are in need. The current crisis is seeing multiple cities and towns attacked and bombed, forcing families to leave their homes and seeking shelter elsewhere. Our representatives and ambassadors in the region report that while refugees have sufficient means to travel and find refuge on their own or enjoy dual citizenship with nearby nations, the majority do not have the resources to provide for themselves without support. UN agencies predict that a potential refugee exodus of over 6 million persons might well be the outcome of this situation. In the meanwhile, many elderly people and those who are sick or disabled in some way are unable to escape the bombing and the stress that accompanies civil unrest. Our concern, obviously, is for them as much as it is for those who have managed to leave. Our staff and volunteers in major population centers within Ukraine continue to provide assistance as much as is feasible, given the ongoing security and safety problems. This past weekend, we held a summit of our regional ambassadors and aid providers under the auspices of our international relief agency, Malteser International. At that time, we were able to review both the growing extent of the refugee crisis as well as the initiatives we are taking to support the growing swell of primarily mothers and children and a small number of senior citizens. As of this morning, it is estimated that almost 700,000 individuals have made the journey across the borders of Poland, Slovakia, Romania, Hungary, and Moldavia. And each day that the conflict continues, the flow of anguished families will grow. We have seen some nations go out of their way to welcome these individuals and to help them through the trauma. Our Order of Malta staff along the border with Ukraine totals over 5,000 personnel, with tens of thousands of volunteers doing everything from serving hot food and drink, caring for the victims of injury and accident, providing counseling and emotional support, and assisting in securing of short-term accommodation. Volunteers from locations away from the border, many of them from other countries, representing churches and community groups, have driven their cars and vans to provide transportation to new arrivals to ensure that they are given every opportunity to find a place to stay. We are coordinating our activities with international aid agencies, such as the Red Cross and the UNHCR, and are engaged in an international fundraising program to ensure that adequate resources continue to be available for the support and maintenance of those in need. We are encouraged that the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva will be holding a debate on human rights in Ukraine today. Representatives from our government will be participating in this important discussion. We appeal to nations of goodwill to appreciate the trauma experienced by all refugees. In particular, we appeal to countries who are receiving refugees to extend the same welcome they're offering Ukrainians to those of other national and ethnic groups who have been caught in this conflict and who are seeking security. The offer of help and support must cross ethnic, racial, and cultural lines and not be tainted by discriminatory acts or attitudes. This conflict in Europe drives home the realization that the issues of internally displaced persons and the needs of refugees forced from their homes affects the whole world, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, and now Europe. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the observer of the Sovereign Order of Malta for the statement. I now give the floor to the observer of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, International IDEA strongly condemns the unprovoked war of aggression waged by the Russian Federation with the involvement of Belarus against Ukraine, a sovereign nation and a democracy. This is in breach of international law and international agreements and a rules-based international order that underpins the shared objective of global peace and the existence of organizations such as International IDEA. The invasion order by the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, is a blatant violation of the UN Charter. As firm believers in the rights of peoples to exercise their fundamental rights and freedoms, we convey our full support to and solidarity with the people of Ukraine. They are innocent victims of this aggression. We salute the brave partners and democracy activists with whom International IDEA has engaged in recent years when Ukraine made huge progress towards being a stable and thriving democracy. We call on the international community to spring into action to protect them and mitigate the humanitarian consequences of the invasion. We cannot fail to note that the military operation was launched while the UN Security Council was meeting to discuss the crisis. We reiterate our firm belief that international crises should be addressed through the means of multilateral diplomacy and resolved on the basis of the principles of the Charter. It is particularly unfortunate that this naked rejection of these principles happens during a pandemic that has rendered evident the need for increased global cooperation to make the world governable and to achieve justice for all. In these days, we are witnessing what an unchecked ruler, for decades trampling fundamental rights and freedoms of his own citizens, can do to undermine peace and democracy beyond his own borders. Ukraine is a country that has successfully reached democratic standards over the past 2 decades, from respecting media freedoms to free and fair elections, local democracy, and the fight against corruption. It is no wonder President Putin is scared of such democratic vibrancy at his doorstep. This is a pivotal moment for Democrats all over the world to stand united in support of Ukraine. It is also the moment to reinforce action to counter and to prevent the rise of authoritarian regimes elsewhere, which cannot survive without kleptocracy and the systematic violation of human rights and freedoms. We call on Russia to immediately withdraw its military forces and fully respect Ukraine's sovereignty. Revanchist interpretations of history and attempts to change borders based on ethno-nationalist fantasies offer not a luminous path for humanity, but a route towards darkness and endless cycles of violence. They certainly don't provide any hope to the younger and unborn generations that will bear the brunt of the climate crisis, or to the billions of vulnerable people around the world that are yet to realize the promise of a life free from fear and want, and the promise of the Agenda 2030. Those are the real challenges of our age. We encourage the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, to make use of his good offices to advance ceasefire talks, humanitarian access to the war-affected areas, and protection of civilians, and particularly the most vulnerable ones. We urge UN member states to adopt and enforce sanctions against the Russian Federation until withdrawal of their forces from Ukraine and the full restoration of its territorial integrity. We urge UN member states to do whatever it takes in compliance with the principles of the UN Charter to stop this war and prevent any further escalation of conflict. International IDEA will do its part in collaboration with the United Nations, our member states, and other democratic governments and organizations to protect in Ukraine and elsewhere the principle that every country has a right to freely determine its own fate on the basis of the will of the people, freely expressed. Democracy's institutions and processes are the best means to protect their right. Today, we must stand up for these principles. Today, we must stand up for Ukraine, which embodies these principles and defends them to our greatest respect. Diakuyu, thank you.
I thank the distinguished observer of the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. We have heard the last speaker in the debate on this item. The General Assembly has thus concluded this stage of the consideration of Agenda Item 5. The Assembly will resume its consideration of Agenda Item 5 entitled Letter dated 28 February 2014 from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine to the United Nations addressed to the President of the Security Council S/2014/136 to take action on a draft resolution issued as document A/ES-11/L1. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine to introduce draft resolution A/ES-11/L1.
Mr. President, Secretary General, distinguished delegates. We are living through a defining moment for our generation. Our generation is the generation that was supposed by our predecessors to be saved from scourge of war. That is why our predecessors created the United Nations. And yet today, it falls to us to save future generations. Let me read the following text. Our position is that whatever grievances a nation may have, however objectionable it finds the status quo, aggressive warfare is an illegal means for settling those grievances or for altering those conditions. It may be that the nation faced desperate problems that would have warranted the boldest measures short of war. All other methods, persuasion, propaganda, economic competition, diplomacy, were open to an aggrieved country. But aggressive warfare was outlawed. The defendants did make aggressive war a war in violation of treaties. They did attack and invade their neighbors in order to effectuate a foreign policy which they knew could not be accomplished by measures short of war. And that is as far as we accuse or propose to inquire. End of quote. Said in his opening statement to the International Military Tribunal on November 21, 1945, in the Palace of Justice at Nuremberg, Justice Robert Jackson, Chief of Counsel. And these words are addressed today to Mr. Putin, Mr. Shoigu, Mr. Lavrov, Mr. Volodin, Ms. Matvienko, and perhaps dozens more, but certainly they are not addressed to the Russian citizens, those Russian citizens who try to preserve their dignity. For almost a week, Ukraine is fighting under the bombs and missiles, fighting in the face of armadas of hardware and countless crowds of enemies. They have come to the Ukrainian soil not only to kill some of us, not only to shift our course and priorities. They have come to deprive Ukraine of the very right to exist. They have come to resolve the Ukrainian issue, as their propagandists claimed. Just stop and think whether these words remind you of something. Yes, more than 80 years ago, another dictator tried to finally resolve the issue of another people. He failed. When the world responded in a resolute and united manner, it was happened immediately, and the delay costed dozens of millions of people. Are we ready to pay such a price now? Or is it time to demonstrate the unity of purpose and deeds already now? We appreciate all manifestations of such unity and solidarity with Ukraine. I would like to express gratitude to all member states that support Ukrainians in their battle for freedom. I would also like to thank those member states that accepted Ukrainian refugees, mostly women and children. More than 500,000 have already fled from Russian missiles and shells. I will not recite all facts of new war crimes and crimes against humanity that the Russian troops have committed since my previous statement 2 days ago. The list is so long that it will run out of time. The crimes are so barbaric that it is difficult to comprehend. Facing the total resistance of the Ukrainian population, Putin's regime has proceeded to widespread use of indiscriminate weapons such as multiple rocket launchers and aerial bombs against the residential areas. Ukrainians are being killed by Russian ballistic missiles and thermobaric weapons. Just yesterday, Kyiv, Kharkiv, Zhytomyr, Mariupol, Melitopol, and many other cities and towns sustained heavy shellings that killed dozens of innocents, including children. Ukraine deeply regrets that a student from India has become a victim of this shelling by the Russian armed forces in Kharkiv. We offer our deepest sympathies to India and the relatives of the victim. A Chinese citizen was also injured in another Ukrainian city because of Russia's deadly attacks. The Ukrainian and foreign citizens have become hostages of the Russian armed aggression against Ukraine. In Kiev, Russian murderers hit the city TV tower, killing 5 passerbys. One of the missiles dropped on the Babin Yar Holocaust Memorial, a sacred place of commemoration of Jews, Ukrainians, Roma, and representatives of other ethnic groups killed by Nazis during the World War II. What an irony when victims of Nazis are being killed for the second time by Nazi modern followers. As the President of Ukraine asked, what was the point of repeating the slogan, never again, in 80 years? It's already clear that the goal of Russia is not an occupation only. It is genocide. On 7th and 8th of March 2022, the International Court of Justice will hold public hearings in the case concerning allegations of genocide under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Ukraine versus Russian Federation. Also, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has decided to proceed with opening of a formal investigation into the situation in Ukraine. Unprovoked escalation of Russian aggression against Ukraine gives reasons to believe that crimes within the jurisdiction of the ICC continue to be committed on the territory of Ukraine. Along with the situation in Crimea and Donbass, recent events suggest that aggressors' troops continue to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity. Dear colleagues, one might consider observing the bloodshed in Ukraine that it is not my war. It is a mistake. The evil will never stop. It requires more and more space to conquer. If tolerated, it advances further and further. The draft resolution is one of the building blocks to build a wall to stop it, to stop in Ukraine and not to let it go further. The wall that will protect all of you, in particular younger generations. Distinguished delegates, by voting today, you also reconfirm your country's commitment to the UN Charter. After the vote, I invite you, ambassadors and representatives, to stop by the Indonesian lounge and to sign this little blue book. Little but of global magnitude. Every vote in favor of the resolution and every signature of country that voted in favor would be a historical reconfirmation of the Charter. It is very easy, ladies and gentlemen, to sign the Charter at time of peace. It is the duty to sign and reconfirm and implement the Charter at the time of war. So stop by the Indonesian lounge, put the name of your country if you voted in favor, and after you sign this book, I will hand it over to the Secretary General for keeping the book in his office, in front of him. So at every single moment, the Secretary General will get an inspiration from the overwhelming majority of nations who still trust in the UN, who still trust in the UN Charter. There is a very fragile gentleman, a very old one. He was born in a territory that was part of the Kingdom of Hungary. he will celebrate his 102 years birthday in 9 days. His name is Benjamin Ferencz. Benjamin Ferencz was an investigator of war crimes, a chief prosecutor at one of the 12 subsequent trials of Nuremberg. Later, he became an advocate of international rule of law and for the establishment of the International Criminal Court. With the permission of the producer, I would play a couple of seconds of his words, and I want you to listen very carefully.
Hard to do. 3 words: law, not war. If you can do that, you save every day billions of dollars, which you can use to deal with the legitimate complaints of old people who need medical care, students who have to pay for their tuition, all the legitimate complaints which could be solved if we didn't spend the money on weapons to kill them instead of helping them. And that is the current system. Now, how are you going to do it? I will end by telling you how to do it and the principles which have guided me. There are 3 principles. 1, never give up. 2, never give up. 3, I hear you, never give up. Good luck. I wish you the best of luck.
Please show respect. Show respect to the Charter. Show respect to the Secretary General. Show respect to this gentleman who will celebrate 102 years since his birthday. I call upon all responsible member states to support the draft. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ukraine. We shall now proceed to consider draft resolution A/ES-11/L1 entitled Aggression Against Ukraine. Before I open the floor for explanations of vote before the vote, may I remind delegations that explanations of vote are limited to 10 minutes and should be made by delegations from their seats. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, господин генеральный секретарь, уважаемые коллеги, Россия просит поставить проект резолюции на голосование. Призываем вас не поддерживать этот проект. Однако мы знаем о беспрецедентном давлении, которое наши западные партнеры оказывали на огромное количество стран, заставляя их проголосовать так, как это угодно им. Это нельзя назвать даже давлением. Это были открытые циничные угрозы. Нам об этом известно. Этот документ не будет способствовать прекращению военных действий. Наоборот, он может ободрить киевских радикалов и националистов и дальше любой ценой определять политику в стране, удерживая в заложниках мирное население. Причем не в переносном, а в прямом смысле этого слова. Сейчас именно так и происходит в ряде крупных городов Украины, где население используется в качестве живого щита. Сегодня стало известно, что вооруженные силы Украины не дают мирным жителям Мариуполя покинуть город. Удерживают их, в
том числе женщин и детей, в одной из школ Мариуполя. Насильно доставляют обратно всех гражданских лиц, которые пытались покинуть город по предоставленным гуманитарным коридорам. Нам также известно и о планируемых националистическими батальонами провокациях, которые они заготовили с участием гражданского населения, с тем, чтобы впоследствии обвинить в этом российские войска. Вопреки нормам международного гуманитарного права, в жилых кварталах размещается военная техника, системы залпового огня, артиллерийские установки. Мы сегодня передадим примеры подобных действий руководству ООН, которое до настоящего момента утверждало, что не располагает подобными свидетельствами. Хотя видеоролики, снятые простыми украинскими гражданами, свободно распространяются в интернете. Ответственность за это полностью лежит на украинских властях, так же, как и за безответственную и преступную раздачу оружия всем желающим, включая выпущенных из тюрем заключенных. Это уже привело к массовым случаям грабежей, убийств и мародерства. Уважаемые коллеги, ваш отказ поддержать проект сегодня стал бы голосованием в пользу мирной Украины, свободной от радикализма и неонацизма, живущей в мире со своими соседями и отказавшейся от внешнего управления. Именно на достижение этих целей направлена наша специальная военная операция, которую авторы резолюции пытаются представить в качестве агрессии. Мы сегодня слышали от украинского представителя слова о нацизме, но он стыдливо умолчал о разгуле неонацизма на самой Украине, о бесчинствах неонацистских и националистических радикальных организаций, о факельных шествиях и прославлении пособников Гитлера. Те, кто интересовался развитием украинского кризиса, прекрасно понимают его генезис. Действуя сегодня, мы прежде всего стремимся остановить 8-летнюю войну майданного режима с населением Донбасса. За прошедшие годы наша страна сделала все возможное и невозможное, чтобы избежать такого сценария. Мы, по выражению генерального секретаря, кстати говоря, перевернули все камни и постучались в каждую дверь, однако так и не были услышаны. Жители Донбасса продолжали и продолжают бомбить, не собираясь останавливаться на 14 тысячах погибших, подавляющее большинство из которых приходится на жителей ДНР и ЛНР. Цели нашей специальной операции, объявленные на основании статьи 51 Устава ООН, выполняются и будут достигнуты. При этом мы не наносим ударов по гражданским объектам и мирным жителям. Не верьте огромному количеству фейков, распространяемых в интернете на этот счет. Эти фейки пеклись, как пирожки, в центре информационно-психологических операций специальных сил операции Украины. Этот центр вчера был уничтожен. Мирный сценарий для Украины можно ускорить, если радикалы позаботятся о сохранности жизни граждан своей страны и не будут прикрываться ими. Такого призыва в тексте поставленного на голосование документа нет. В нем также ничего не сказано о незаконном перевороте в Киеве, когда в феврале 2014 года при попустительстве Германии, Франции и Польши и при поддержке Соединенных Штатов был свергнут законно избранный президент страны. В этом проекте нет ничего и о том, что новые националистические власти тотчас же ограничили права граждан на использование русского языка. Это дало старт огромной цепочке нарушений базовых прав жителей Востока страны. И не только Востока, включая самое ценное право – право на жизнь. Многие из вас не хотят ничего слышать о трагедии, которая началась на Украине после майданного переворота 2014 года, о заживо сожженных людях в Одессе, о преследованиях и убийствах несогласных, И самым ярким проявлением этого стала развязанная Киевом война против Донбасса. Ничего в документе нет и о том, что на протяжении 8 лет Соединенные Штаты и Европа накачивали и сейчас накачивают Украину вооружением, помогая майданному режиму убивать мирных жителей на Донбассе. Оправдывали лояльные киевские власти за полное игнорирование минских договоренностей и саботаж резолюции Совета Безопасности 2202. Наконец, этот проект – это очевидная попытка тех, кто за последние десятилетия совершил бесчисленное количество агрессий, незаконных с точки зрения международного права военных операций, переворотов, одним из которых стал и майданный переворот на Украине, выставить себя поборниками международной законности. Благодарю вас.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Serbia.
Most sincerely regrets events taking place in the east of Europe. Russia and Ukraine have always been friendly country to the Republic of Serbia, and Serbian people perceives Russians and Ukrainians as fraternal nations. We felt loss of life of each man in Ukraine is true tragedy. The Republic of Serbia is committed to observing principles of territorial integrity and political independence of states as one of the basic principles of international law based on UN Charter and final act from Helsinki from 1975, which guarantees the right of states to inviolability of borders, just like it is committed to preservation of sovereignty and integrity of its own territory. The Republic of Serbia, likewise, advocating respect for territorial integrity of other sovereign nations, and regardless of not agreeing with all formulation stated in resolution, will vote in favor of resolution. I am obliged to point to PP 13 and remind that the first attack against a sovereign state on the soil of Europe after the Second World War took place not so long ago, in 1999, when 19 countries attacked, at that time, Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, primarily Republic of Serbia, when there was no appropriate reaction of such distinguished institution to this flagrant violation of UN Charter, despite the fact they still suffer from consequence of severe violation of fundamental principles of international law by others. Serbia is not giving up these principles even today. The Republic of Serbia will continue to advocate termination of conflicts, expecting that the parties will invest additional efforts into reaching diplomatic solution and creating conditions for peace throughout dialogue. Serbia will provide all kind of humanitarian aid to endangered Ukrainian citizens while remaining committed to peace and consistent respect for international law. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Serbia, and now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Syrian Arab Republic.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. سيد الرئيس، إن مشروع القرار المعروض أمامنا اليوم يمثل بوضوح نهجا منحازا يستند إلى دعاية سياسية وأداة من أدوات الضغط والابتزاز السياسي. لقد حرص معدو مشروع القرار على تضمينه لغة عدائية موجهة ضد الاتحاد الروسي تستهدف النيل من مواقفه المشروعة والمستند إلى مشاغله الأمنية وحقه في حماية أرضه وشعبه من التهديد الحقيقي للأمن القومي الروسي.